The European Medicines Agency convinced the benefits of AstraZeneca's vaccine outweigh the risks. The positive assessment coming a day after several EU nations suspend its use over blood clot fears. In Myanmar, thousands flee a Yangon suburb after the military imposes martial law. This as the funerals are held for the dozens killed during a bloody anti-coup protests on the weekend. And talking tough on China, the US Secretary of State visits Asia on the Biden administration's first senior foreign trip to shore up alliances in the region. Welcome to the France 24 newsroom in Paris. I'm Alexander Rourcott. And the French Prime Minister has said he wants to boost confidence in the AstraZeneca vaccine by getting the jab himself as soon as his government reauthorises it for use. The European Medicines Agency has said there appears to be no clear link between the Anglo-Swedish shots and dangerous blood clots as feared, though there are fears that there could be a connection prompted by a host of other nations to suspend its use on Monday. Olivia Salazar-Winspear has more.
Caution and concern versus continued faith in the jab, two different attitudes to the AstraZeneca vaccine, and it seems that optimism has won the day here in London.
How do you feel about AstraZeneca?
I believe in scientific advice, and scientific advice is that we should be taking it, so I'm certainly going to be taking it.
Yet some national authorities are not convinced. A number of European governments suspended the AstraZeneca vaccine amid fears it could be linked to fatal blood clots. This comes after the death of a 49-year-old nurse in Austria admitted to hospital with a pulmonary embolism. It's reported that at least 37 people have suffered some form of blood clot after the vaccine, so is there cause for alarm? Scientists say the data must be analysed carefully. On average, 1 in every 1,000 people suffers a thrombosis every year. Given that 17 million people have had the AstraZeneca jab across Europe, 37 is actually less than average. As for whether precaution is the best modus operandi, the European Medical Agency says so far there's no clear link between the vaccine and these conditions.
They have not come up in the clinical trials and they're not listed as known or expected side events with this vaccine. In clinical trials, both the vaccinated people and the people who received the placebo have shown some very small numbers of blood clot developments.
Both the WHO and the EMA have warned that vaccination campaigns provide the most effective strategy against COVID-19 and that the benefits outweigh the risks when it comes to lowering mortality rates from the virus.
Well, staying with the authorities in France that are paying close attention to what appears to be a new strain of COVID-19, the first developed in the north of the country. Officials are particularly concerned about the so-called Brittany variant because those with it appear to show symptoms of coronavirus, though their PCR tests come back negative. Delano de Souza explains.
79 coronavirus cases reported at this hospital in northwestern France on Saturday. But 8 of the people infected had their PCR test show up as negative, even though they exhibited symptoms of COVID-19.
Ce n'est pas un variant qui est classé à ce stade comme variant préoccupant. Vous connaissez quels sont les variants préoccupants. Ce sont les variants V1, V2, V3, les variants anglais, sud-africains et brésiliens.
Initial analysis shows the Brittany variant of COVID-19 isn't more transmissible, but experts say it's too early to tell.
Pour l'instant, c'est considéré comme un variant à surveiller. Vous voyez ce que je veux dire? Il n'est pas mis dans la même case que variant sud-africain. Il faut des informations. Il faut des informations pour savoir s'il y a une augmentation de la transmissibilité. Et là, ça sera encore plus compliqué parce qu'il y a peu de cas.
C'est pas parce qu'on découvre un variant que c'est forcément un problème. Ce qui est problématique, c'est si ce variant devient majoritaire dans une zone ou même dans un pays.
Health experts in France are examining how this new variant responds to vaccinations. Authorities in Brittany, meanwhile, have ramped up measures to limit the spread of COVID-19, and residents are being advised to refrain from gathering.
Looking now at the latest figures coming from France, and there have been almost 30,000 new COVID-19 infections recorded in the latest 24-hour period, the biggest jump in well over a month, and an additional 408 people have sadly lost their lives, taking the total now to over 91,000 since the start of the pandemic. With the Greater Paris region one of the main hotspots for cases, the Prime Minister said earlier that the time has come for additional restrictions. Erin Ilkinki tells us more.
Just one day before the anniversary of France's first coronavirus lockdown, tough news for residents of the Paris region. A third one in the near future is officially on the table.
We're in a worrying, critical situation. It seems to me that indeed it's time to consider further measures for the Greater Paris region.
The Prime Minister's remarks came just hours after he confirmed France has entered a third wave of the pandemic, largely characterized by an increase in more contagious and deadly variants. But the bleak outlook doesn't stop there. With 419 positive cases for 100,000 residents per week, the Paris region has also crossed the infection rate threshold of 400, which the Prime Minister had set just 2 days ago. And the rising infections have pushed the region's health facilities to the brink, with 100% of intensive care unit beds now occupied by COVID-19 cases. Hospitals have evacuated more than 100 coronavirus patients to less overwhelmed regions.
It's better to act later than never. It's time for another lockdown to get the epidemic under control. It's the only measure that will allow for alleviating pressure on intensive care units, which would save lives. That's what this is about.
While President Emmanuel Macron has suggested an aggressive vaccination campaign could help stave off another lockdown, France already lags behind many of its neighbors. And health workers warn the temporary suspension of the AstraZeneca vaccine could push an end to the crisis here further out of sight.
We move on now to Myanmar, where at least 2 more people have been shot dead this Tuesday as families held funerals for the dozens of protesters killed by the security forces at the weekend. The United Nations estimating almost 150 people have been killed so far since the junta seized power just over 6 weeks ago. The worsening crackdown has also led to thousands of residents fleeing a Yangon suburb this Tuesday after the army imposed martial law.
They gathered all the belongings they could, an act of last-minute desperation. After the increasingly bloody crackdown on pro-democracy protesters, these residents of Yangon say they had no other choice but to flee. And they're far from alone in their fears. On Tuesday, patience was of the essence for those who fled the industrial quarter of Yangon, the site of the bloodiest day of protesting since the army seized power in early February. After several Chinese factories were set ablaze, the military junta declared martial law across much of the city Sunday, cutting communication services and firing live rounds on protesters, despite international calls for de-escalation.
At least 5 deaths in custody have occurred in recent weeks, and at least 2 victims' bodies have shown signs of severe physical abuse, indicating that they were tortured. We are deeply disturbed that the crackdown continues to intensify, and we again call on the military to stop killing and detaining protesters.
In an effort to step up the pressure on the military, French Foreign Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian announced the European Union would approve sanctions against the business interests of those involved in the coup early next week.
Meanwhile, the Biden administration says it's pursuing a unified, tough-minded stance on China. This ahead of talks in Alaska with China later this week. Washington said it would make clear its concerns about China's behavior regarding Hong Kong, human rights violations in the Xinjiang province with the Uyghur Muslims, and Beijing's continuing malicious cyber activity. The statement comes as the US Secretary of State and Defense Secretary visit Japan as they shore up alliances in Asia to better compete with Beijing.
the first overseas trip by top cabinet officials in the Biden administration. America's top diplomat and defense secretary held face-to-face talks with their counterparts in Tokyo. Both Anthony Blinken and General Lloyd Austin using the occasion to put China on notice.
We're united in the vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific region, where countries follow the rules, cooperate whenever they can, and resolve their differences peacefully. And in particular, we will push back if necessary when China uses coercion or aggression to get its way.
China is a pacing challenge for the Department of Defense. And we know that competing in today's shifting global dynamics can only be done through the spirit of teamwork and cooperation.
The visit to Tokyo comes days after Joe Biden met virtually with the leaders of Japan, Australia and India as part of the Quad alliance. Beijing says the forum is an attempt by Washington to build a mini NATO in the Indo-Pacific. Secretary Blinken and General Austin will head to South Korea next. This as the US mulls how to handle North Korea after Washington's overtures to Pyongyang have gone unanswered. While Joe Biden has reaffirmed America's commitment to NATO and its transatlantic allies in Europe, standing up to China remains one of the hallmarks of his young presidency to date.
Now, this week marks 10 years since the beginning of Syria's civil war that's seen hundreds of thousands killed and millions more displaced. In the latest in our series of reports from the region, James Andre visits a village on the Lebanese side of the border with Syria, where an influx of refugees has transformed life for residents.
Karoun village is located in the southern Bekaa Valley, just a few kilometers from the Syrian border. Here, the population has doubled since the beginning of the Syrian conflict. 5,000 residents and 5,000 refugees.
They play sports with us. We are together for weddings and funerals. They're part of the village life. Here, this is one of the camps.
At the beginning, Syrian refugees were welcomed with open arms in this predominantly Sunni Muslim village. Landowners offered their fields to build camps, and then years passed and things changed.
Tensions are rising because people come to us and ask us to get rid of the tents so they can recuperate the land. That's something the local council can't do, so we get the blame.
Tension further heightened by the economic crisis that has hit Lebanon. As the Lebanese pound collapses, so does the village's purchasing power.
Now Syrians have more money than us, the Lebanese. They buy all sorts of stuff because they get money from the UN and they work as well. There's no work for us and we're not getting any help from anyone.
I am Lebanese. I pay taxes. I give the state a lot of money, but I can't find any work. And I'm not getting any help from the state.
At the supermarket, locals are now paying more attention to prices. Yet, despite the crisis, some do see advantages to the presence of Syrian refugees.
We cannot ask them to leave because they have become essential. They're an abundant and efficient workforce here at the supermarket, cleaning houses or in the fields. They are really helping us.
For now, most Syrian refugees prefer to stay this side of the border, both for security and economic reasons. But for this village here, that means there's no end in sight.
James Andre reporting there from Lebanon. Last up, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has announced the country will prioritise diplomatic engagement with Asian countries over the next decade in a major post-Brexit diplomatic shift, setting out his vision of the, quote, global Britain. The document also outlines plans to overhaul the UK's defence policy, with plans to increase the nuclear stockpile catching particular attention. For more on this, here's Vedika Bahel.
It's their first big policy review since Brexit. Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced on Tuesday that the UK will not be reducing its stockpile of nuclear weapons, but instead grow its nuclear arsenal by more than 40%. The UK is currently estimated to possess 195 warheads, but the cap on the number of warheads will now increase to 260. This change comes after the UK previously pledged in 2010 to lower the amounts to 180.
First outcome of the integrated review was the government's decision to invest an extra £24 billion in defence. The overriding purpose of this review, the most comprehensive since the Cold War, is to make the United Kingdom stronger, safer and more prosperous, while standing up for our values.
The British government argues that mounting foreign threats and nuclear-armed states were behind this massive increase in defence budget. Iran's foreign minister has said it's hypocritical for Johnson to be concerned about Iran's nuclear efforts, whilst increasing his own stockpile. The review also stated the UK will refocus its foreign policy to India, Japan and Australia, and pledge to do more on the systemic challenge of China. Over the next 4 years, the government plans for Britain to also invest at least £6.6 billion in space, directed energy weapons and advanced high-speed missiles.
That's the end of this edition. Stay tuned for more world news on France 24.